We do. Hi everyone. We do have room. We have some room at the front. We definitely, people can squeeze in a bit. Definitely have open seats. Silas, is the live stream on? Yes. Excellent. Hi everyone, welcome. Hi everyone, my name is Pierce and I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series here at Brookline Booksmith and your host for tonight's conversation. I want to open up this space by saying thank you for coming out tonight. It feels kind of like a party with you all here. The Booksmith has been around since 1961 and that's because of our wonderful community. Your support means we can keep having events like this, so thank you again. As you may know, tonight's event is part of our ongoing Transnational Literature Series, which focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please check out our full events lineup online at brooklinebooksmith.com so you don't miss some of the amazing authors we have coming up this season, both virtually and in store. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram for updates. Toward the end of the event, we'll leave about 15 minutes or so for an audience Q&A followed by a signing. We have copies of The Case of Gem available over at the register. And please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I think that takes care of the business end of things. Now I'd love to tell you a little bit about our guests. Tonight I have the very great honor of introducing Angela Rodel and Vera Messud to discuss and celebrate the release of Angela's translation of the Bulgarian classic The Case of Gem by Vera Mutafchieva. Angela Rodel is a literary translator who holds degrees from Yale and UCLA in linguistics and ethnomusicology. 8 Bulgarian novels in her translation have been published in the US and the UK, and she has received NEA and PEN translation grants, including an NEA grant for her translation of The Case of Gem. Her translation of Georgy Gospodinov's Physics of Sorrow won the 2016 American Association of Teachers of Slavic and East European Languages Prize for Literary Translation. And most recently, her translation of Gospodinov's novel Time Shelter won the 2023 International Booker Prize. A 2-time Fulbright scholar, she now lives in Bulgaria, where she serves as executive director of the Bulgarian American Fulbright Commission. And tonight's moderator, Claire Messud's best-selling novels include The Emperor's Children, a New York Times Book of the Year in 2006, The Woman Upstairs, and The Burning Girl, a finalist for the LA Times Book Award in Fiction. She is also the author of a book of novellas and a memoir and essays, and her work has been translated into over 20 languages. She writes for Harper's, the New York Review of Books, and the New York Times, among other publications. Her new novel, The Strange Eventful History, will be published by Norton this May. She teaches creative writing at Harvard University and lives in Cambridge with her family. I'm so pleased to have them here together in conversation. Now, Angela and Claire.
Thank you, Pierce, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Angela. And I don't know how many of you have yet had a chance. How many people have read this book? Has anybody read it? Not yet. Some have read it in Bulgarian?
Yes.
Yes, in the original. Well, I suspect those of you who are able to read both the original and the English are in for a particular pleasure, because it reads so grippingly. It's absolutely unputdownable, and indeed one of the questions, I have so many questions to ask you about so many things, but maybe we could start by, Angela, if you would tell us a little about how you came to translate this, and whether and I suppose which some of you may know the answer to, but I don't have a Bulgarian connection, so I don't. Where it fits in the canon of Bulgarian literature.
Okay. Well, I just want to say first, thank you so much, Claire, for being with me tonight, and thank you to Pierce and the whole team at Brookline Booksmith, and thank you, friends and soon-to-be friends, for coming to the event tonight, and all the Fulbrighters and Bulgarians from Boston. So it's really, really special to be here with you tonight. The case of Jem, actually, my previous husband, he's a poet and a writer, and when I was first getting interested in seriously thinking about translating Bulgarian literature, I said, well, what about, the classical canon? What books should I start reading? And he thought for about 10 seconds, was like, The Case of Jem. And so I trotted out and read The Case of Jem, and I was really interested and impressed that, it was published in 1967, but I think those of us who have read it and those of you who are reading it, it's a very avant-garde work for socialist Bulgaria in the 1960s. Just if we start from the structure of the novel as this court of history, through the fact that one of the main characters is openly LGBTQ, and it just very and talking about the Ottoman Empire, which at that time was not. Vera Mutafchieva herself was a historian who specialized in the Ottoman Empire, but that part of Bulgarian history is often de-emphasized with a refocus on the sort of Bulgarian Slavic national history. And so all those elements, I was like, this is such an interesting book, and it had sort of stayed in the back of my mind. And I had translated one other book from the Bulgarian canon, Wolf Hunt, which Claire also was so kind as to discuss with me here in Boston. And it was really difficult because the US market, the English language market, and I think in general, it's easier to have a living author that, a newer work, a contemporary work that can be in conversation. And so having had a lot of challenges getting that book to the readership, I sort of thought, well, I'll just focus on contemporary literature, which is also great, the Bulgarian contemporary literature. But then a really serendipitous thing happened. My publisher Buzz, who's back there, we had worked together on a book, 9 Rabbits by Virginia Zakharieva, and 10 years ago perhaps, and it had a really great, I think, working experience. And he actually just emailed me out of the blue and said, hey, do you know this book? I said, of course I know this book, it's a great book. And his partner, his publishing partner, is Croatian, and he had read the Croatian translation of Jem and thought, this is a great book, why is it not in English? So it was a really long time kind of bubbling, serendipitous way that Jem has now appeared in English for the first time, which is, I think, filling a big hole because it's in almost every major European language, including Turkish. It's been translated, it has like 4 editions in Turkey. So I think it's nice that English audience will finally get access to this Bulgarian classic. In terms of where it sits in the canon, I mean, Vera Mutafchieva is probably the most, I would say, prominent and famous female novelist of the 20th century in Bulgaria. And many critics have called this the first modern Bulgarian novel, because before that there were novels, but they were classic and usually historical novels in the sort of more straight ahead sense of the definition. And it was a sensation when it was published, and she actually turned her energy at that point more from academic work to fiction, and continued to write dozens more books. But yeah, it's I think absolutely a key part of the Bulgarian canon. And interesting, in Bulgarian, it's often kind of sold as like YA, like sort of youthful literature. But to me, I think it's all the different layers that it contains is absolutely not, it should not be relegated to something like YA. It's definitely, I think, for a much wider readership.
Well, it has these, it has, as you say, these many layers, and the scope and scale of it is quite enormous. It's worth saying that for those who aren't familiar with the novel, that the reason that Jem is the protagonist, and I'm going to ask you to explain a little the context of who Jem is, but it's sort of framed as a trial almost,
yes.
and so each of the speakers, and how many are there in total? I didn't count them.
About 15 at least, yeah. 20.
Right.
Yeah, lots of different witnesses are called to speak to maybe the reader, maybe the court of history, to give their testimony.
And one of the things in terms of its freedom that's fascinating is that they are speaking now. So there's or as it were when it's written. So they're speaking from beyond the grave, and they're speaking with the knowledge of the history that would come between
their time
and now, which gives it a sort of
it's a really interesting conceit, because they, every human being, we can't get out of our historical time, but these ghosts sort of have the advantage of the long perspective, the 20/20 hindsight. So yeah.
So I have to confess that for me, I was, in addition to being riveted by the characters and the plot, but above all the relations between the characters, I was learning a little more intimately a history that was fairly vague to me. Yeah. So would you like to give a little set piece for who Jem is and who's with him?
Yes. So Jem is essentially one of the sons of Mehmet the Conqueror. So the Turkish Sultan who died very unexpectedly, kind of in the prime of his life in 1481. And the law of the House of Osman is that the oldest son becomes the new sultan, and all the other brothers are strangled, which, if you have a harem, that could be a lot of people. But when he died unexpectedly, the older brother, Bayezid, was very close to the clerics, and many factions of the army did not think his rule would be advantageous to them, and so they tipped Jem off before he could be strangled. And it sets off an internecine war, and I think I'm not spoilering if I say, because this happens pretty early in the book, Jem loses. And he finds himself in exile in Europe. And that's where the book really begins, his sort of wanderings through Europe, and the sort of tension between East and West, and how the European powers use him as a pawn in their own power games. And I think it's really interesting as a historical case, but also the interesting thing that many Bulgarian literary critics say about this is that Vera Mutafchieva, she, in the early 1960s, her brother Boyan had defected to France, a very famous physicist, and in many ways it was a way for her to express her grief over her brother, because at that time it was not possible for him to come back and visit. They couldn't really have much communication, and so this idea of this young man in exile from the east to the west who becomes a pawn of political, maybe, schemes that he really doesn't understand, there's many different layers. So there's a historical layer, and then I think there's a very personal layer that Vera Mutafchieva is expressing. And she couldn't say this openly in socialist Bulgaria in the 1960s, but that, this idea of this young man wandering in exile is very poignant for me, at least as a reader.
And an evolution, a sort of tragic evolution,
yes.
Or devolution of who he is.
Yeah.
There's some. Did you ever read the Purloined Letter, the Edgar Allan Poe?
Yes.
And I feel as though he becomes rather like the letter in the Purloined Letter. He's this cipher to everyone else. He's a cipher that gets moved around.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing, because there's all these witnesses. The one person you never hear from is Jem. He's basically this character that he's projected upon by the Europeans, by his own, Ottoman supporters and maybe not so supporters. And it's really interesting that he's the one person that is not called to testify, because he is this sort of cipher of sorts.
And in the beginning he has quite a retinue, but that changes. And
Yes.
and one of the key witnesses is the person who remains with him. Would you tell us?
Yes,
a little?
yeah, no, by far my favorite character, and I think what really makes this book resonate is we don't hear from Jem directly ever, but we do hear from Sadi, a character named Sadi, who's a Persian poet who was a member of Jem's court. And I think it's really interesting that Vera Mutafchieva is a historian, and she generally is very, I think, meticulous about the history, but then she plops into the book this central character who is not historical. I mean, she basically, from what I was able to research, there was no Sadi in Jem's court. He's based on a 13th century very famous Persian poet, one of the three great Persian poets with Rumi and Hafez, I think. But I think she definitely drew inspiration from the historical Sadi. He was actually wandered in exile for some 30 years before he returned to his hometown of Shiraz. And so it's really interesting how kind of the linchpin of the story of a very historically accurate, tale is this ahistorical, character. And he and Jem, it's very interesting that he's sort of speaking from the point of view of Jem, and it becomes apparent that they were fellow poets, but they were also lovers, and their relationship throughout the book develops in many different ways. I don't want to be a spoiler, but it's really a really interesting and beautiful framing for the way that Jem is portrayed throughout the book.
And indeed, the one of the many layers is this sort of fairly intense psychological portrait of Sadi himself as a speaker, but also of their relationship and of Jem through Sadi's eyes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the important thing too is that Sadi is a poet. He's and it talks about I think this tension between like pure historicism that the court is trying to find out what the facts were and sort of artistic speech and how Sadi at that time poetry was sung poetry, and this idea that he's telling a different type of emotional story that's the way it interweaves with the sort of more straightforward historical narrative, I think is a really interesting literary device that she uses. This, the tension between fiction and history. Sadi kind of personifies that in the story.
And then I don't think it's a spoiler, but that one of the characters says to him at one point, but it's not Jem who's the great man. You who are the poet, you are the great man, and you are the person who will live through the ages. And you're the fact that if you're not writing poetry or you're not singing verses, that's the great disaster.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, Sadi, but that's true and it's not true though, because Jem had a really interesting sort of afterlife, because he was picked up by the troubadours, also the sort of Western version of Sadi, the singing poets, and he became a sensation in like the 16th century France. Zizim, he was called Zizim. I don't know why that was, but he became an almost mythological figure. I think a lot of sort of Orientalist interest in this figure of this exiled prince, and so he did, in some sense, live on, but through poetry, through fiction, and not through anything really historically connected to his actual life.
I'm wondering whether this might be a good moment for you to, if you'd be willing to read a little and share with us just a snippet.
Of course, yes. I think I'm going to read one of my favorite sections that comes towards the end of the book, but it will explain the beautiful cover art, which I am very thankful to Sandor for. This is once Jem and Sadi have been, they've been pretty much imprisoned by the French. So, November 10th, 1487. Today we received a thoughtful gift from Brother d'Aubusson, a monkey and a parrot. Jem peered at the monk who brought them with suspicion. In his striving to provide entertainment for His Highness, Brother d'Aubusson offers this modest present, the monk whispered. He set down the 2 cages and slipped out. After spending a half hour contemplating the new additions that had disturbed our solitude, Jem got up. He walked around the cages with a distracted air, before sitting down on the floor in front of the monkey. I was amused as Jem tried to find a common language with the little creature, making funny faces and gestures, silly sounds. Meanwhile, the monkey was studying him, its new companion, in great detail. It apparently came to some conclusion because it finally stuck its paw through the bars and grabbed hold of Jem's finger. Jem laughed aloud with the new, not quite sane laughter hashish brings on. He opened the cage and picked up the animal. The monkey tolerated this and began playing with Jem's buttons. Then it jumped onto the bed and entertained us with some real monkey business. Sadi, Jem asked me, still laughing, do you think I could teach it to play chess? Why not, I replied, glad I would now be entirely freed from Jem's silent, heavy presence. You can have the parrot, he said magnanimously. I can't stand the smell of birds. Thus, I became the proud owner of a parrot, exactly what I had so long been missing. I dragged the cage into my little room, where there was just enough space for the two of us. I dumped it onto the floor, thinking I would let the parrot starve to death. Perhaps that would infuriate Brother d'Aubusson. I was almost out the door when it hit me. There is no God but Allah, I shouted at it. If I repeat those words to it every day, will it learn them?
Thank you very much. But I know that's a passage that shows the humor,
Yes.
and also, and the liveliness, and also the darkness.
Yeah.
Because they're functionally prisoners at this point. I'm. Which direction? I feel as though it's worth, maybe everybody knows, but just to explain about they aren't yet the Knights of Malta.
Yes.
The reason that they end up on this trajectory is because they have fallen into the hands
of the Knights Hospitallers of Rhodes. And yeah, no, it's really, I mean, it's a fascinating time in history. It's really when the Ottomans were starting their ascent and their entrance into Southeast Europe. And the idea was that Jem could be used as a pawn to threaten Bayezid, who then became the Sultan, and push the Ottomans back out of Europe into Turkey. And so he becomes an absolutely invaluable bargaining chip, essentially. So he first goes to Rhodes willingly, thinking that he will find allies and support, and then eventually finds himself. The thing is, it's really interesting why Jem never speaks, because the Europeans don't really care who. They just need him as a symbol. They just need him alive. He might be out of his mind in hashish, but he's alive, and so they can always threaten Bayezid. We're going to let your brother loose, and give him to the king of Hungary, who's then going to come and invade the Balkans and push the Turks back. So he's really, when he first falls into the hands of the monks, of these knights of Rhodes, he really is quite naive. I think he doesn't understand the scheming. I would say the Europeans do not come out of this looking good. I would say this is, everybody in this game is playing a very, very bloody game. It's.
Although I kept feeling that perhaps the Hungarians came out better.
Yeah, the Hungarians
better than most.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I'd say if there had to be.
Yeah. But it is an extraordinary array. I mean, it's so many parties are involved. I don't know how. Is this period of history clear in people's? Are people? Yeah, clear, medium clear.
He's from Harvard. It's clear.
Okay. Because there are. I mean, there's Venice. There's Venice. There's Naples. There's Rome. There's the French.
There's the French, but then there's also the Hospitallers, who are sort of French, but they have their own agenda.
But they have properties in France, which is where they first send him. So will he be, who's in control of him when he's in the properties in France? Then within France, there are rival factions.
The Duke of Savoy versus the king, and
then there are the Germans.
Yes.
And then there's Cairo.
Yep, there's Qaitbay, the Sultan of Egypt.
Yes.
So it gets very, very complicated very quickly.
It's a sort of fascinating. It's fascinating because it is like a chess game. It's not for nothing that the monkey is to be taught how to play chess, because sometimes the moves are sort of three moves out. If you see what I mean, it's the move in anticipation of the move. So I understand that she was a historian of the Ottoman era, but how is this a central story for Bulgarian leadership?
I mean, I'm not sure it is directly. I think, to me, what is so interesting that she picked this particular, and that she named it the case of Jem, that it's really an interesting historical case. I think, first of all, that it brought back this period of history. In Bulgarian, the sort of dominant historical narrative is generally kind of against the Turks. Like, we define our national identity as liberation from the Ottoman Empire, even though there's a 500 period when Bulgaria was part of the Ottoman Empire. So for her to, it's before that, it's kind of unheard of to have a historical novel that's written by a Bulgarian author, focused entirely essentially on the Ottoman Empire. So I think that in and of itself was a really interesting statement about what Bulgarian literature could be. And then I think the allegorical level, that she couldn't speak openly about what was happening in socialist Bulgaria, but when she's talking about it through the cover of an Ottoman historian talking about this, case that happened 500 years ago, but you can make a parallel between her brother that, defected in 1963 and Jem. I think that's where the sort of points of overlap happen with Bulgarian literature, but it's a very interesting strategy. And her other books, many of her other books deal with, with Bulgarian historical figures. Many of them are sort of more straightforward Bulgarian historical novels. So that's what makes this one so unusual.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I remember, this is now 30 years ago, meeting an Albanian writer named Besnik Mustafa at a residency in France. And I don't know whether he's yet been translated into English. He wanted very much to be translated into English. He was translated into many languages and quite a bit into French. And he was often in articles referred to as l'autre albanais, because he was not Qatari. So that seemed to, a tough. But I remember him saying that this was in the mid-90s, but I remember him saying that the project of writing fiction for him had been to find allegories that would be clear to his readership, but that he could write without being put in jail.
Yeah.
Right. That there's sort of the narrow strait between saying something and would she have been navigating that as well?
Absolutely. I think she's an interesting and problematic character. I think we should be frank. Her father was a very famous Byzantine historian who passed away in 1943, so before the communist coup in Bulgaria, but he was very well respected, so he would have, if he had survived, he would have probably been tagged as a bourgeois intellectual and probably would have suffered some kind of repression. And then her brother being a defector, it was essentially, I would say, probably inevitable that she was approached by the secret services. She apparently became a collaborator of the communist era secret services in the late 1960s, sometime right around the writing of this book. And it's really interesting to me. I'm not justifying that choice, and I think it makes her a problematic figure. And this did not come to light until a year before her death in 2008. And I think it was very shocking to a lot of people. To me, I'm wondering, there's a scene when Jem is about to cross the border from the Ottoman Empire into Turkey, I think, or into Syria, which was, and he says, I'm saving my life, but what am I giving up? I basically betraying everything my father has built. And I was wondering, is there a resonance here where she feels like, okay, by agreeing to collaborate, you're making it such that you wouldn't have been able to publish, you wouldn't have been able to have an academic career, but on the other hand, you're having to, take part in a morally repugnant system. And, Jem also finds himself in very morally repugnant situations. And I'm just wondering how much she saw of herself, actually, in this figure. So there's her brother, but then there's also herself. But that's purely my own conjectures.
But I felt that as just a reader completely from the outside, that they enter a world in which there are spies everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And there are, in a private conversation in a room, there are spies behind the walls. There are tunnels in the palaces so that people can eavesdrop and report. And you don't necessarily know the person where the person that you're speaking to stands. And I think that we hear so much that was the experience everywhere in Eastern Europe. For so long. And I was thinking, I actually don't fully know the Magda Szabo story, but I know that she was not able to publish for a decade. The consequences were maybe it was more than a decade. I mean, the consequences, if you didn't, Herta Muller was in a I'm not sure of her story either. I mean, I think that
there were real consequences to refusing to cooperate. Yeah,
and at some point, there is the choice of where do you sort of save yourself. I mean, thinking about that exhortation that Renier makes to,
Yes, yeah,
to
to
Sadi,
Sadi.
saying, you know, your art is the most important thing, your art is more important than everything else. Is there a moment where that trumps, you know, is there a sort of debate going on, does that trump?
I would think so. I would.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very,
Yeah.
so what's her legacy now?
I would say it's mixed because she's clearly a fantastic writer, and her books, you know, remain popular. But then there's a lot of, I think there was a lot of shock, a lot of anger when that was revealed. And so I think, I mean, like most things concerning the socialist era, and the Bulgarians here can chime in during the discussion section. I think the society is still very divided. There hasn't really been maybe a reckoning, like a very, you know, general societal reckoning of how we think about this period and how we move forward, how do we talk about it. And she's part of that, you know, these figures that are very problematic for that period, yeah.
For you as a translator, was this, did this endeavor pose any particular challenges?
Yes, I mean, I think every book has its own challenges. For this, I think what's really interesting, Vera Mutafchieva, you just read the first page, she throws you into the Ottoman world, and she's, you know, clearly had a very, you know, grasp of Turkish. And for Bulgarian readers, there's a lot of Turkishism still in contemporary Bulgarian, and so I think she creates this really interesting balance of there's things that are in Turkish that the average Bulgarian does not, they're not borrowed into Bulgarian, but there's enough hints that you get the sense of something that's foreign but familiar. And I think that's what kind of makes these two levels of the novel work. But as the translator, I can't count that my English readers are going to have that same, you know, grasp of and access to Turkey and Ottoman vocabulary. So I had to try to, and some things do translate. We have Pasha, we have Vizier, we have those sorts of things, but not anywhere near as much as Bulgarian does. So I was sort of trying to keep the balance of keeping the atmosphere of the Ottoman Empire without being too alienating to the English reader, and that was a difficult balance to strike at times. But I think one that was important because we want to have this sense that there's something working on two levels.
And how about finding the different voices of the different speakers?
Yes, yeah, that's the thing too, that it's all first person narration, because every chapter is a different witness that's been called before the court. And so there's a certain, I don't want to say monotony, but there's, you know, it's in and of itself, first person narration has, you know, certain structures. And so, yeah, trying to make sure that Sadi's voice, because pretty much every other chapter is Sadi. You hear another witness, you hear Sadi. You hear another witness, you hear Sadi. And making sure that his voice was consistent throughout the novel. I usually translate kind of chronologically from start to finish. And so, you know, there was a period of the editing and kind of working process where I had to just kind of look only at Sadi and make sure that I kept his voice consistent and differentiated from the other witnesses. But yeah, there was purely structurally there were challenges with this novel.
It's interesting because you say in the introduction that you broke I don't know if it was a rule, but a habit that you'd had always before.
Exactly, yeah.
On his account.
Yes, and I don't want to be a spoiler, but yeah, I generally, I'm of German descent. I like things to be linear, and I go from start to finish. And this book, when I got to a certain part near the end, I just was so emotionally kind of upset that I skipped it. I was like, I can't translate that. And so then I went and finished the book, and then I was like, well, I guess I got to go back. So yeah, I did sort of break my own traditional translation strategy, just because I was so involved with the characters and with the narrative that I just felt kind of emotionally, I don't know, like bereft when I got to that part. So,
what is it about? I mean, each of us. I mean, I know what makes him so alluring to me as a character, but what for you makes Sadi so special?
I guess the fact that he's a poet and he sort of refuses to be. I mean, the whole book is this very kind of materialistic. You know, they're paying off everyone with gold, and that he just refuses to be drawn into that and refuses to sort of mentally admit that that's, you know, or engage with that. He just, you know, he knows what's going on. He's smart enough to know what's going on, but he just is like, you know, I'm going to live And I think as someone, I mean, I'm also a musician, and he is a singer and a poet, and there was just a sense of resonance with him. As you said, like, your art is the most important thing, and even though he's drawn away from it, he finds his way back to that, and that to me I thought was very, very powerful for him as a character and as a narrator. So, and then he's just funny as hell. Like, I mean, he's like very bitchy at times, which is, you know, very refreshing in a medieval, you know, courtroom drama. So,
But what
yeah.
he's also, I feel that his devotion
To
takes
Jem,
many different forms.
It does,
and,
yeah.
And he's able, I mean, he also seems like a pretty cool.
Yeah, very loyal, and you know, his relationship with Jem, it's first very like romantic love, and then it's loyalty, companionship, friendship, and then it's almost like a mother to a child. But this person who, even when everything is against him, refuses to see the hopelessness, or like believes that somehow he can help this person, you know, with his presence and with his companionship. It's you know, a very moving story of.
You said, you mentioned at the beginning that for him to be a central character as a queer character in the novel would have been uncommon.
Yes,
when
it
the novel
probably
was
helped
written.
that they weren't Bulgarians. I think that in 1960s wouldn't have fly. I mean, in contemporary 2023, there's not very many novels that are openly LGBTQ characters. And it's really interesting. I was doing some research beforehand, and with this book, and it seems like the Bulgarian LGBTQ community points to this book actually as sort of a groundbreaking, at least a novel that has very positive characters that just, you know, happen to be from that community. And so it's just such how this got published in 1960s Bulgaria is a really interesting question.
Was it something that, I mean, is it something that people have tended, you know, historically to comment on or to even notice, or was it just seen as, oh, well, those Ottomans?
Yeah,
they're
those
different from us?
Orientals, yeah, you know, it's the Eastern, but yeah, no, but I think it was such a great story, and it was just so compelling that it, you know, sort of, and the fact that it was, slightly culturally removed, maybe was more palatable.
You may not know the answer to this question, but the hashish, historical?
I think that must be a conjecture. It's probably based on historical research, I would assume, but I think she can't know. I mean, we don't have any diaries from Jem, and Sadi is clearly a fictional character, but I think I think she's probably, you know, embellishing that. But I think if you imagine what you would do in that situation, many of us might be tempted, sort of hopelessness,
Yeah. And the other, so because there's also a female love interest.
Yes.
And is that a historical?
Yes, that's absolutely historical. And the interesting thing is that this Hélène de Sassenage, I'm sorry, I don't speak French. Claire's probably cringing at my pronunciation, but she apparently had a child by Jem, and there was like descendants of Jem in France. So it's a really interesting, and I don't know if Vera Mutafchieva, I found that on Google, you know, but it's really, and his son was like known as La Turc. I mean, there was really, it was a real relationship, yeah. So it's a very interesting story, yeah.
But then she took the veil?
Yeah, I think that might be a little finessed in the book. Yeah, I think she did not necessarily go straight to the monastery, the cloister in real life. But yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. It's that question. That, well, again, even that is a time when what side are people on and what's really happening when things are. Nothing is as it seems. Nothing is as it seems in this world. Maybe this is a moment to open to the audience, if people have some questions that you'd like to ask Angela.
It's just phenomenal that you're back after the wolf hunt, and thank you so much for just honoring Boston and the Bulgarian community. It's great to have that relationship reviving with every possibility. So thank you. Congratulations on all the awards and the recognition. For bringing Bulgaria to the world stage, and there's so much that can be said, and you're doing a fantastic job.
Thank you.
You've mentioned before in interviews that AI is a big factor, not necessarily a threat, but a big factor in also translators' profession. Were you curious to see what what ChatGPT would do with your text. Were you trying this out in any way?
ChatGPT, no. But DeepL, if you want to translate, you do it. Don't use Google Translate, it's terrible, but it's not terrible, it's better than it used to be. But there are quite good programs. I think, and talking to my colleagues in translation, I think we can't bury our heads in the sand. I think it's another tool that we can use. I don't think it'll completely replace us. I think it's a tool that we can use. It's not good with register, which to me, a really good literary translation, it's all about register. And that's something that in my opinion and my experimentation with these platforms is that it's not very good about register. But I think back like translators 100 years ago, like there was no Google, there was no, and Google is very helpful because you can see when a word was used, how anachronistic is it, what kind of context is it used, and it's a very helpful tool. And so I kind of see all the AI things as being yet another tool in our toolbox, and I think there's no shame in using those, but I don't think you could just run it through the translator and then turn it into your editor. So and I think about translators 100 years ago, you had to have the most amazing like Kultura, just knowledge of the cultural history, how you spell names, and like I taught translation for 10 years at Sophia University before the kind of boom of ChatGPT, but I allowed my students, I was like, I wouldn't make you translate a way that I don't translate. I don't use Google Translate, but I look things up on the internet. I use thesaurus.com. I think those are tools that all of us as translators, should take advantage of judiciously. But with the idea that it's art at the end of the day, so it needs to have the human soul.
Well, I mean, this book is. Every translation is a transformation also, and this book is so beautifully written and so compellingly written. You nod. I'm saying you.
Oh, okay. I thought you said Vera. Vera's a great writer.
No, not that you shouldn't nod, but I feel like I'm not speaking about Vera. I'm sure Vera's book is great, but Angela's book is fantastic, and that isn't something that the AI I think is able. It's the music and the rhythms.
Exactly. Yeah, I think. Yeah. I mean, and it's really interesting how actual translation is sort of thematized in the book too, because at a certain point, whoever holds the language, the ability of the language, like Sadi, one of the other characters tells him, you have to learn French because Jem can't trust any other translators. Like you need to, in the power of being that conduit, what power that gives you. That it's really interesting the way it's thematized, and I think there will be, there will always be a place for that human element in that, because in that conduit. Yeah. Oh. Speaking of thank you to the Bulgarian community in Boston, thank you, Theodora, for getting the word out.
Along the lines of translating and partnering with the author, was it a blessing or a curse not to have Vera close by to talk to?
I never met Vera Mutafchieva, which is a shame because I was in Bulgaria before she passed away, but I never came across her, which is a real shame. And this is only the second time I've worked with a text by a deceased author. The previous one was Ivailo Petrov, and it's hard because I'm kind of in a privileged position translating into English that many of my authors speak English well enough that we can kind of have a conversation like, well, what do you think of this passage? What about these connotations? And I think when you're working with someone who is no longer with us, it's a really kind of frightening sense of responsibility because I am this person's voice and I can't say, do they like the direction I'm taking this? And I feel a real sense of responsibility towards their legacy in a way. So I find it somewhat stressful in translating authors who are no longer with us, but this is the case, I think, with all of my colleagues who translate the opposite direction. If you're translating, Jonathan Franzen into Bulgarian, he's not going to be answering your emails, for this Bulgarian translator, so you really shoulder that responsibility. I mean, of course, you have editors and you have critics, other people that you could, and I did talk a lot to Bulgarian critics to kind of get a sense of, like, her as a person and her body of work, and you have to rely on those kind of wider networks that I think most translators who don't have access to authors are used to shouldering. So it was an interesting experience.
May I just ask, when you're working, say, on one of Georgi's books, do you sort of sit down with the manuscript open together? Or
Absolutely.
Yeah,
You did, absolutely, yes, yeah. No, Georgi spent a year in New York. His English is very good. His wife's English is very good, Biljana, and she's a literary critic. So usually the three of us, and it's great. I mean, I'm very honored that I live, 10 minutes away, and I can be, if I'm just really, struggling or frustrated, be like, yeah, let's go get a coffee and talk about this passage. So, and he's been incredibly generous, with his time. And with not just with me, but with most of his translators, because I live in Sofia, and the other people usually come through to visit, and he always introduces us so that we have access to each other and can discuss how did you solve this, what did you do. So it's really, he's an extraordinarily generous author in that respect. Yeah.
That's it. That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
And would that be true with other? I mean, or is that a particularly close working relationship?
Yeah, I think Georgi is maybe he's very he has maybe more of an American style idea of craft. I think a lot of Bulgarian authors it's maybe a more romantic conception that this is this work that kind of came into my brain, and then what's this translator doing, coming and moving around my commas and digging around. And so sometimes it's a little more. I generally have very, very good relationships with my authors, but it can be a little bit fraught, And I think Georgi, having been in the business and having been translated to so many languages, he has a more of an American style MFA craft approach. Okay, it's okay if I say, Georgi, this really isn't working in English. He's not gonna take it personally, or just say, okay, we need to find a way to find a solution. Whereas authors who haven't had the experience of being translated and being sort of in the international scene might feel it's maybe harder to hear those kinds of have those kinds of conversations at first. But yeah, no, it's interesting. It's a very intimate relationship. It's a work of art, a creative work of art. So you do have to kind of make sure that you click with the person, sort of emotionally and psychologically, so that you'll be able to kind of have these sometimes very heated conversations about how I think the book should sound, how they think the book should sound. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm coming to you.
There's a post here.
Yeah.
I think a mic is coming your way.
Loud.
For the recording, I think. Yeah.
So I'm a classical musician of the Bulgarian community, and when I work on a piece of art, and when the composer is alive and not dead,
Yes.
I feel much more constrained because I feel the obligation to do justice to the notes which I'm supposed to interpret from the page. When I feel very liberated when I do not know the composer, or maybe I could hear a lot of his music or her music on the internet, but they are not in the studio when I'm recording. So it was to me very interesting that you said that actually the collaboration between the author and the translator is favorable in a translation, because to me, musicians and translators, especially classical musicians, are exactly the same role. They interpret somebody else's viewpoint or a story.
Yeah, this is true to some extent, and as a musician, I have felt that parallel. I'm not a composer, but I think at a certain point there have been, I think English gives you a bit of power, like being a translator into English, because it's a very prestigious market for a book to be in. And so I have an advantage of privilege, let's be frank, of being a native speaker translating from Bulgarian into English. So I think that gives me some leverage to when I'm working with an author, I want to be respectful. If they really are not happy with the decision I've made, I'm open to, discussing why and thinking of other solutions. But there are times that I'm like, okay, if we're going to work together, like, you have to trust me. Like, you did your work and it's gorgeous, but you need to, and there's been, so I've had to have some kind of, tough conversations with certain authors. And I think for the most part they've heard, and there has to be some kind of trust that, I'm going to, because the thing is, everybody can hear music, but they can't hear the music the way a native speaker of English is going to hear it. And so they just, there's that's maybe where the difference is, that, okay, we have to have that kind of trust that you have, given this precious work to me, and I will be doing everything I can for both of our benefit. And it's tough, though. It's very emotional. I think it is sometimes difficult for people to relinquish control or share control, for sure.
I love what you said about trust.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I do believe
Mhm.
with live composer and a musician,
Mhm.
there should be a level of trust. So.
And then sometimes you're just not the right interpreter. I mean, there's
Yeah.
lovely books that I enjoy very much, but I kind of, if I don't feel like I can hear the voice and I have a sense of how it should sound in English, I'm not the right translator for that. And it doesn't mean the book isn't good, it just means that, we just don't resonate, and there's many other great translators that hopefully will resonate. So.
Thank you.
May I just sneak in? Sorry, I know you have just on the translation front, and this is just I have done very little, but some translation from French to English, and French, of course, is quite a, I don't say this in a pejorative sense, but quite a pompous language with a lot of graces and qualifications and sort of a lot of this. And if you translate it literally, it can seem rather stilted or leaden. And I'm just wondering if there's something that, if there's something almost a texture when you're translating from Bulgarian that there are there graces that you have to take out or graces that you have to put in, or is there something like that, or perhaps not?
Yeah, no, in Bulgarian academic writing, for sure. That's always a pretty heavy rewrite, because I'm like, no, really, people, like, we're in English, less is more, but in fiction, it's not so much. I think there's more, the style is maybe more flexible and light, but that said, certain authors, word order, of course, is always interesting, and Bulgarian has a really cool thing where the definite article is the end of the word, and it makes this really cool rhythm, like ta 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 at the end of words, and that many authors play with that, and the way to kind of get that sense of staccato, that sense of movement in a passage is often very difficult, because we don't have that horrible sound, like it does not hit the same way at all, so that's sometimes tough to kind of get that sense of sounding that Bulgarian writers often like to play with. But yeah, I think
almost energy.
Yeah, it adds a lot of energy. Yeah.
Forgive me.
Sorry. Thank you, Angela. This is such a treat to not just meet you again, but to talk about this wonderful book. And thank you, Teddy, for encouraging us to read the book before. Yeah. So I'm reading it in Bulgarian. I'm totally enjoying it, and I'm looking forward to reading it in English. And I thank you for the nuances that you just shared with us, and the sensitivity to the language and the rhythm of the language. I'm curious why, and you might have answered this question earlier, but I'm just curious, how did you come across it, and why now? Because the Eastern question somehow is alive today, and very, very much so, as the world is dealing with similar situation, just in a different
Absolutely.
age.
We did talk about this a little earlier, so we can talk over wine about that. But I think what you mentioned, it's so relevant. I think after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I mean, it's just so timely, the message of this book, because essentially there's a threat from the East, and the Europeans, instead of getting their act together, are fighting amongst themselves, letting themselves be bought off, and it's just, there's so many lessons, I think, here for our current situation in Europe. I think it just, to me, was stunning. When I was rereading it, in preparation for the translation, I was like, wow, this is, clearly human beings. Human nature does not change at all from the 15th century, from the 1960s to 2020s. I think there's a lot of relevance, and that's actually, I hope this is one of the things that will interest a wider readership in this novel, not people that are just interested specifically in the Balkans, but in general, like Europe, like how Europe kind of abandoned half of the continent because it couldn't see, everyone was looking so much at their own very short-term goals and sort of, I'm going to screw my neighbor here, instead of, okay, we're losing an entire half of our continent. It was really a lot of lessons.
It feels very contemporary.
It does,
yes.
yeah.
And I do feel recent history has that sort of unsettling thing that the only way it makes sense is if you go way back. This has never happened. You're like, oh no, it happened many times before, just centuries, just further back than our lifetimes.
Yeah, and I think this is another layer of the allegory, because I think Vera Mutafchieva was also talking about the Soviet bloc. She was talking about the Iron Curtain. With this idea that the West had abandoned half of Europe behind the wall. And so I think there's many layers here historically.
Should I go in Bulgarian or English?
In English for everyone online.
English. So I'm gonna bring Angela back probably 18, 19 years ago, and main street of Sofia Vitushka. I met her there with my wife and someone else. So we went for dinner, and we said, "Oh, we're just relocating to United States. Have you been in America?" And she said, "I'm American." I'm like, "Wow!" So amazing English. People that don't know something about Vera Mutafchieva, Professor Vera Mutafchieva, she was a very, I would say, extravagant in her own way person. So you can always find her crafting her books. She used to make about 9 different editions of books that have been already published in many languages.
Yeah.
So she was sitting in a famous Bulgarian village called Pavelsko with her friend, and she was rewriting and editing a book that's been published 9 times already to make sure it's perfect. And her friend told her, "Why are you still doing this? That book's been published everywhere." So I was like, "I have to be perfect." And if you picture that perfect author, I can only imagine how difficult it was to get into that role and to be in that character, to be able to translate that. And I just read a couple of pages in English because I did in Bulgarian, and I must say this is fantastic. It makes me feel 99.9999% if I read it in Bulgarian, so thank you for doing that.
Thank you. And it's really interesting that you brought up the question of the versions, because actually Gem is out of print in Bulgarian. It's just part of a volume of like collected works. And so I went to I ordered from like antiquarian bookstores a number of different versions, and I found that actually there were different in like pretty major, like the endings of some of the sections were different, and I was like, whoa, and I don't know, I mean, I don't want to quibble with Vera Mutafchieva, but I thought some of them, maybe I liked some of the earlier versions better. I was so as the translator, I was sort of like, I don't know what to ask. So I kind of went with the version that I liked best. And it wasn't always the same version. I would look at the different texts, find where the differences were. Like there's the part where it's the end of the 3rd chapter where, basically Jem says, history will forward, but without me.
Right.
And in the original version, it was so powerful. And then there was a later edition, I can't remember off the top of my head, that I felt was like watered down. I was like, oh no, I'm going with the version. Sorry, Vera. But and that's when the author is no longer with us. You have to, I guess.
but maybe that's better. You got to override.
Yeah,
You got to
exactly.
override
So
it.
but it was tough because I saw that she had done that. It was very interesting. And then there was the more recent edition that had come out on Jeanette Chitiri Bent that had been re-edited, and so there was like an editor's also changes, and so it was very interesting kind of trying to reconstruct what we thought the original text should be, and there's no right answer.
Or the best one.
Yes, yeah, there's no right answer. So
I feel as though you should organize, or someone should organize an exhibition where people can see all the different, just even like one chapter, see all the different versions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an extraordinary.
Yeah, and I think maybe this was kind of common, because I think in A Wolf Hunt, in Heike Zawolci, the other book that we had talked about here in Boston, there were also different versions because it was first published in chunks and then only put together kind of the very end of the communist period. So then there were different versions as well. So yeah, it's I think writing of that era, it was not uncommon to have that sort of sense that there's no final edition that you go back.
But I think this is happening nowadays too with Milan Ruskov's
Yes. Yeah, and then cutting down Cham Korea into 2. Yeah, that was a good move. I love Milan. Yeah. And that might have been practicality, because like selling a 2-volume thing is pretty intimidating for the reader. But yeah.
Did you have a question?
Yes, sure.
Hang on, we're gonna send you.
I'm coming.
Send you a mic, Pearson.
Thank you. And hello, and thank you, Angela. I'm an academic, and I was recently speaking with an academic editor who said Bulgaria is kind of having a moment, like in the scholarly world. And it seems like Bulgaria is having a moment in the literary translational world too. And I'm wondering if, I don't know, is there, this is a nebulous question, but is there kind of what does Bulgarian literature have to say to like Western European literature and to American literature? Is there kind of a similar sort of thing that's being said by a lot of the books that you've worked with? Maybe not.
Well, no, I think actually yesterday I was just at my alma mater in New Haven, that shall not be named, in this crowd. And I actually gave a talk about Time Shelter and The Case of Jem, because they're both talking about history, memory, how we tell history, how we sort of frame the past. And I think that's something that Bulgarian authors definitely grapple with, having this communist past, that there's no sort of understanding of the way that we think about that past. And Georgi certainly, has done a lot of, there's the personal nostalgia of your own childhood, but then there's like the very dangerous collective nostalgia of, propaganda that is being abused by populist politicians. So I think Eastern Europeans, including Bulgarians, who have lived through a period of propaganda, disinformation, this sort of falsified history, they have a lot to say in, what might be kind of new and shocking to all of us with the, the rise of fake news and disinformation on our telephones, So I think many, it's interesting, I think, Bulgarian friends, especially of an older generation, they're very, they're hard to fool. There's a critical thinking, that I think having lived in a society where you're being, fed propaganda I think that's something that the West and Western readers can learn a lot from. How do you push back against that? But the entire society around you is sort of this fake narrative. How can you create an authentic connection to other people? How can you create a narrative of truth? I think there's just so much that Eastern European literature, and I think that's why Time Shelter hits such a nerve with the Booker, not just Booker, but like international readers, is that, Georgi was really pulling those questions to the forefront, that are questions that all of us, Europe, America, are grappling with.
Hi, Angela.
Hey, John.
For those of us who are more and more enjoying your style as a writer, do you have a new project on tap?
Yes, several. Not as a writer, but as a translator. Georgi, his first novel, natural novelist, roman, which was translated but not in full. And many years ago, we're going to work on a new version, which is very exciting because it's an awesome book. And then some short stories. And I'm working with a really cool young Bulgarian female writer named Joanna Elmi. We're team translating, which for me is super interesting because her English, she lives in the States, her English is phenomenal. And we're working together. So yeah, I've got some interesting things in the pipeline. Thank you.
Thank you. So on the topic of Bulgarian literary translation having a moment, and just a disclosure, as somebody who majored in linguistics and worked in translation, not literary translation, but translation, and gave up very fast. Just for everybody else's context. I gave up very fast because I felt like when I did a good job, nobody noticed.
Mm-hmm.
That was my job, was to not be noticed.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I very quickly had the calling of, okay, I think I need to do something else with my career. So with that in mind, I just wanted to say thank you for the amazing body of work that you have already given us, literary translation work.
Thank you.
I'm sure a lot more to come. We're here to look forward to that. But can you speak a little bit about your personal path and how did you end up doing translation and what is fueling your work? Because you need a lot of really good fuel to be able to sustain it.
Thank you.
And to produce work that really speaks to people and authors.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for the kind words. And yeah, it's true. Iglika Vasilyeva, who's a phenomenal translator from English into Bulgarian, she's translated James Joyce, she's translated just incredible. And she's like, yeah, literary translation is just kind of inherently a second fiddle type thing, and if we do a good job, nobody should notice us. If you're reading something and being like, God, this is a weird translation, like that's usually not a good sign. But for me, I do really feel like it's a calling. Like how I ended up in Bulgarian is I was a member of the Yale Slavic Chorus. I was studying Russian literature, And I had always been a musician, a singer, and I was like, oh, that's good, it was like Russian, but music. And they played Bulgarian, they played The Mystery of Bulgarian Voices, and I was like, oh my God, what is that sound? And I just became completely obsessed with women's folk singing, like Bulgarian choral music, and I spent the next 20 years like learning to make my voice sound like that voice in the front row, Elica, amazing folk singer. And at a certain point, as you know, like you can't sing convincingly if you don't know what you're singing, so it was just a natural thing that I had to learn Bulgarian language. And then when I was living in Bulgaria in the early sort of, I guess, 2004, 2005, I realized, okay, I had all these friends who were musicians and writers, and there really weren't that many of us who spoke English as native speakers that had the level of Bulgarian to translate. And I thought, okay, this is my time to give back. Like, I have gotten so much from your culture, like this incredibly beautiful music and culture, and it's like, okay, I can give back. I can use my voice to help your voices get there. And I really feel like it's a calling. And I guess I don't mind that much that it's a second fiddle type thing, because I have gotten so much out of it. Like, I feel like, you know, I can't imagine what my life would be like if I hadn't met Bulgarian, if I hadn't met Bulgarian music. So to me, it's like, this is the least I can do. Like, really, you know, just to like make this beautiful country and this beautiful culture more visible, like, great. You know, that's, to me, it's, you know, maybe I'm getting a little sappy here, but no, it's really, I really do feel like it's a calling. And I think most of us who are translators feel that way, that there's something very personal that motivates us. And it's not just me. I want to say I'm not the only translator. Like, I taught translation for 10 years. I have really amazingly talented students. There's other Bulgarian Americans that are translating. So we're gathering steam, and you'll see a lot more of us. So, which is great. You know, there's a lot of great literature that still hasn't been translated.
I think that's our end. Thank you all so much for your questions. They were astonishingly good. Oh my gosh. This is my first event of the year, and all of my other events, the audiences, they have to like come up to your level.
We've raised the bar.
Thank you. Yes, the bar is so high. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Angela. This has been
Thank you, Claire.
fantastic. Oh my gosh. Round of applause for Claire.
Yay!
Don't worry, we'll get to Angela too. And now Angela, woo! Angela will be signing books. We're going to do a very orderly line to her side. And we've got books for sale in the back. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight.